Will there ever be peace in the Middle East? And if so, what will it take to bring it about?
I think there will be, but I've come to the conclusion that even with the tremendous will and resourcefulness and bravery of the Palestinians fighting the daily immiseration they have to face by Israeli occupation, there has to be a change in U.S. policy. It seems to me absolutely clear that Israel could not be doing what it's doing now, which is basically to reject and to stand in the way of what is obviously its international obligation, namely to vacate the territories it occupied illegally in 1967, and thereafter to recognize the sovereign existence of a Palestinian people in its own state. That Israel cannot continue to refuse to do that were it not for the unconditional support of the United States. That is to say, I'll give you a perfect example. The roadmap, which is a plan to bring peace between Palestinians and Israelis, a plan written by the so-called Quartet, the Soviet Union, Russia, the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union, has been accepted outright by the Palestinians. The Israelis have not accepted it. And Sharon has said that he will not accept it until he comes to Washington in June and to speak to George Bush about his, I don't know, I've heard 15 objections, I've heard 100 objections he has to it. But the intransigence of Sharon and his people would not be possible were it not for the support of Washington. And Washington would not be possible were it not for the fact that it takes for granted the quiescence, the somnolence, the passive acceptance of most Americans in just accepting this as a matter of fact. The fact is that the United States supplies Israel with $5 billion a year. That's $10 million, more than $10 million, almost $15 million a day that come out of our tax dollars. And unless we say this is not in our interest, we are creating enemies of not just of the Islamic and Arab world, but of the whole world, compounded now by the Iraq War. This is not in our interest as a people. It's unjust, and it causes misery. We are subsidizing the misery and suffering of others. Unless we say that, then the policy will simply go on and peace will never happen, because people don't give up that easily. Sharon and his tanks will continue. They get them from Washington. They don't pay for them. And I find that outrageous. They're using American weapons to kill innocent Palestinian women and children, and men and boys and everyone. And we just sit back and say it's okay. Why? Because most people are pretend they don't know, are afraid of being called anti-Semitic, don't want to take on the Israeli lobby. I mean, one could give a lot of reasons for it. But this, in the first place, this is money that should not be spent abroad in any case. It should be spent here where we need it, on tremendously crisis-ridden areas like education, like, as I mentioned, health insurance. I mean, there are thousands of things that we could better spend the money on here than supplying Israel with more tanks and fostering this incredible illusion that Israel is at risk. Israel is a major superpower now. It has an arsenal of 200 nuclear weapons. It has the most advanced air force in the world after the United States. It has a navy. It has every kind of artillery, and is supplied by us with anti-missile defenses. What's that all about? It's simply a suicidal policy for the United States and for Israel. And unless we, as American citizens, exercising our sovereign right to have a say in foreign policy, to have a say in the expenditure of the dollars that we pay the Congress through our taxes, this will go on more or less forever. So my idea is that we need an enlightened, an emboldened, a mobilized people, not just for peace between Palestinians and Israelis, that's terribly important, of course, but also for the other derivatives of that problem, which are the militarism and the kind of imperialist idea towards the whole world, that we are somehow outside, perfectly and arrogantly expressed by Bush when he abrogated refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol on pollution. We all live in the same world. And the problems of the world are interconnected. Terrorism, the environment, human rights, they're all part of the same pattern, and we have to be able to see them that way. And until we act on the basis of our real human obligations and entitlements, there'll not only be no peace in the Middle East, there'll be no peace anywhere. And I think this is really one of the things that an imperial power wants. It wants to create, as I said at the end of my talk, to divide and rule, to keep the world in a state of perpetual anxiety so that American dominance can prevail. I'm against that. I think it's immoral, and it is leading the world into areas where all kinds of new problems are emerging. And I think, as I say, the key to the whole thing is citizens' awareness and action.
Professor Said, do the Zionists have any historical claim to the lands of Israel?
Of course, but I would not say that the Jewish claim, or the Zionist claim, is the only claim or the main claim. I say that it is a claim among many others. Certainly the Arabs have a much greater claim because they've had a longer history of inhabitants, of actual residents in Palestine, than the Jews did. If you look at the history of Palestine, there's been some quite interesting work done by biblical archaeologists. You'll see that the period of actual Israelite, as it was called in the Old Testament, dominance in Palestine amounts to about 200 to 250 years. But there were Moabites, there were Jebusites, there were Canaanites, there were Philistines, there were many other people in Palestine at the time and before and after. And to isolate one of them and say that's the real owner of the land, I mean, that is fundamentalism. Because the only way you could back it up is say, well, God gave it to us. Yes, but I mean, Christians think that God gave it to them, and Muslims think that God gave it to them. I mean, that's not a rational argument. So I think the people who have a history of residence in Palestine for a certain amount of time, including the Jews, yes, and of course the Arabs, have a claim. But, and this is very important, I don't think any claim, I don't care whether it's given by God, about whom I have many doubts, by the way, or by the emperor, nobody has a claim that overrides all the others and entitles that person with that so-called claim to drive people out. I mean, that's the point. This is a very, very important point. I mean, Jews have a claim, and I've never denied that. Of course they do. But is it a claim that can tell a Palestinian, well, you've got to leave this house because I mean, I got it 3,000 years ago. I mean, it's true I come from Poland or from Brooklyn, but I have a bigger right to this house than you do. So get out. I'm sorry, I disagree with that kind of logic. And if there was some way, as there seems to be now, there is a formula accepted by the world, and shared also with many Israelis and many Palestinians, many Arabs, for sharing the land. I mean, I think that's the better way to look at it, than say, no, one claim is superior to all the others.
Professor Said, could you expatiate on something that you raised in your talk, namely the rise in Arab nationalism as a result of the Iraq War and what that means for the rest of the world?
Well, I didn't really talk about the rise of Arab nationalism. The rise of Arab nationalism is much older than the recent war in Iraq, but I certainly think that most people in the Arab world watching the war, not on CNN, which gave a very distorted view of it. Well, I mean, television is essentially a distorted medium. But just watching the war in the Arab world, I happened to be in Cairo, actually. I arrived in Cairo on the very day that Rachel Corrie was killed, and I was still in Cairo on the 19th when the war began. And from that perspective, you get a different view. Most Arabs felt that the destruction of Iraq was a terrible thing. Iraq is a central, Baghdad plays a unique, I say, the most important place in the history of the Arabs as a people, of any city. It was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, which lasted for about 500 years between the 8th and the 13th centuries, destroyed by the Mongols. And in modern times, it's the cultural, intellectual, and even technological center of the Arab world. So the destruction of Iraq by high-altitude electronic bombing was felt as a humiliation and a defeat by every Arab. There was no love lost. Nobody cared much about Saddam Hussein. Everybody thought of him as a rogue and a terrible dictator. There's no argument about that. But the sense of invasion of the Arab space by an outside power, namely America, has increased. I suppose that's a form of Arab nationalism. And I think there's also a general feeling around the world, it's not exclusively an Arab thing, but I think there's a feeling in which many people share it, namely, what is the United States doing over there in the middle of Iraq? We're going to be, the Army and Jay Garner and Paul Bremer and all the rest, and Bechtel and Halliburton and Standard Oil, and we're going to be there for a very long time. And the attempt to try to redraw the map of the Middle East is not going, which Paul Wolfowitz announces every day at breakfast, is not going to be accepted idly. But people don't take kindly to someone. I mean, we know that from history. There are always movements of resistance to colonial intervention, colonial domination. It was the history of the French Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Belgian Empire, and so on. And I think this will happen there too. So I think that's very important to consider. And last point to be made is there really is a very strong cohesion between different kinds of Arabs who speak the same language, who read the same books, watch the same television, share a history. As I tried to say in my talk, there's a sense that our area has been targeted for colonial intervention since the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, invaded the place in the 16th century. It's still going on. So I think the kind of reactive nationalism will occur. It may take Islamic forms, as it already has begun to do in Iraq. But not only that, there are secular forms of resistance, which I think are beginning to emerge. There is, for example, in the Arab world, an Arab human rights movement, there's an Arab women's movement, there's an Arab environmental movement, there's an Arab freedom of expression movement, there's an Arab secular movement, there's a very strong Arab democratic movement fighting on several fronts. You're not only fighting despotic regimes, but you're also fighting an outside American force which is trying to come in the country and plunder and rule it for its own benefit. So, you know, the situation of the Arab today is to take refuge in a collective Arab identity. It's a natural, I think, consequence of the configuration of forces.
On a different topic, could you speak to the issue of the human rights of Muslims and Arabs in the U.S.?
Well, I could speak about it to a certain degree, but it's quite clear to everyone here that since 9/11, about which, as you notice, I didn't speak very much, because I think there's been a tendency, I mean, there's no denying that it was a horrible atrocity, but there's been a tendency to exaggerate its importance and to turn it into excuse for all kinds of terrible behavior, including racist discrimination against people who we think are our enemies and deserve to be treated as second-rate or alien or somehow enemy peoples. And it's in this context that Arabs, Muslims, people of color from the Indian subcontinent have been treated with great disdain for their civil and political rights in this country. All you have to do is to ask an Arab or a Muslim or an Indian or a Pakistani or an African coming into the United States. First of all, it's much harder to get visas now. I mean, there's a whole subject to be talked about immigration, because this is a country of immigrants, and for us suddenly to say we only want white people, or if you're Swedish you can come in, but you can't if you're a Palestinian. I mean, that is, to me, unacceptable, because America was based on the notion of openness, of boundaries. And what makes us unique and strong and interesting as a people is that openness. Well, that's being threatened by the Patriot Act, by the Terrorist Act, by the practices of John Ashcroft and the Bush administration. And I think every Arab, I've written this in several things in the past year, every Arab and every Muslim in this country is made to feel like an enemy alien. It's emphasized by the media. I mean, how many times, you know, they talk about Arabs quoting the elders of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Well, that's an outrageous thing to do. It's a terribly slanderous and anti-Semitic work. But, on the other hand, How many times have you seen on American television Arabs referred to as camel jockeys or towel heads? How many movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger killing hordes, dozens of Arabs, just spray killing them all? The Arab is an object of hatred, of violence, of terror, and Islam as a religion of violence. Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell. These are important figures in the my voice is going, in the United States. And this has added to the climate of antagonism and bellicosity. The slander of Arab civilization, of Arabic culture, all of these things have made it very difficult for Americans of Arab and Muslim and subcontinental descent to survive this period. But again, I think there's now beginning a reaction to this. In U.S. policy, it seems to me absolutely clear that Israel could not be doing what it's doing now, which is basically to reject and to stand in the way of what is obviously its international obligation, namely to vacate the territories it occupied illegally in 1967, and thereafter to recognize the sovereign existence of the Palestinian people in its own state. That Israel cannot continue to refuse to do that were it not for the unconditional support of the United States. That is to say, I'll give you a perfect example. The roadmap, which is a plan to bring peace between Palestinians and Israelis, a plan written by the so-called Quartet, the Soviet Union, Russia, the United Nations, the United States.
Will there ever be peace in the Middle East? And if so, what will it take to bring it about?
I think there will be, but I've come to the conclusion that even with the tremendous will and resourcefulness and bravery of the Palestinians fighting the daily immiseration they have to face by Israeli occupation, there has to be a change